All right, everybody. So as we continue our discussion about the age of reform in antebellum America, we are moving on to one of the bigger, weightier elements of reform movements in the 19th century. That's going to be really the birth of the women's rights movement. So let's see what we can put together. So a little bit of the College Board phrasing coming into play here, and this is one of the more obvious College Board statements. The antebellum women's rights movement was developed in order to create greater equality and greater opportunities for women. This is a little bit, I mean, like in all honesty, when we think about the women's rights movement in the 20th century, 21st century, we're talking about economic and social rights and equality in all regards whatsoever. In the context of the antebellum years, this development of the women's rights movement is really about a response to the changes that are taking place, specifically the changes that are happening within the American family. Back during the Revolutionary period, there was the idea of Republican motherhood, the idea that women, wives and mothers, were going to become the moral caregivers of American society, teaching the next generation how to be a good, proper American, both in their morality and in their religion to a certain point, so far as their ideals, both political and economic, that's all kind of there. But then as you get into the market revolution, the growth and the cult of domesticity is going to take that idea of Republican motherhood and it's going to entrench it within the household. That really more and more as you're going through the 1810s to the 1820s, even in the 1830s and beyond, the traditional viewpoint is that women's roles as being the moral caregiver of the family, it really is just in the private world, in the domicile in your house. So, not really in a public setting, not as a leader in the workforce, not as a leader in politics, not as we'll kind of see, leader in social reforms. This is kind of where you get into the controversies that starts to come into play. Because we've already established through some other pieces of this lecture that women do play a role in other reform movements. We talked about Dorothea Dix and the reforms in mental hospitals and and prison reforms. We even talked about Amelia Bloomer in class. But women, middle class women, played a huge role in the American Temperance Society. This is another reason that the temperance movement is sometimes seen as being as a more proper version of the more proper way of saying reform about domestic violence or domestic abuse, putting the blame on alcohol instead of putting the blame into family structures, because that would not really have been acceptable in the 19th century. But women are in leadership positions all the way through the temperance movement, going from the 1820s, gosh, until like the prohibition days of the 1920s. As you move into the 1830s, and I know we have not really talked about the abolition movement at this point, but in the abolition movement, there are a couple of notable ladies that are heavily involved with this. Lucretia Mott, who's in the picture here, and then the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina. Now, Lucretia Mott was a Quaker. She was born in Massachusetts, but she lived bulk of her life in Pennsylvania. And as a Quaker, pacifist beliefs that are a part of that religion also led in the early days of the American Republic. Quakers took a pretty strong stance for the abolition of slavery, and Lucretia Mott gets actively involved in that movement. Sarah and Angelina Grimke are actually Southerners that kind of saw some of the mistreatment that was going on of enslaved workers in the South, and they took a moral stance. Part of they saw slavery as a violation of their religious beliefs, so there's a little bit of religion here on both the Grimkes and on Miss Mott. So you can kind of layer in some of the Second Great Awakening ideals. Where the controversy starts to come in is that for all three of these ladies in different circumstances, they want to take a more active role in the abolitionist movement. They want to speak in front of abolitionist rallies, and they are told in no uncertain terms that that is not allowed, that it would be inappropriate for women, regardless of really who they are and the roles that they have otherwise. It would be inappropriate for any woman to speak to a crowd of men, and so they were kind of blocked and limited from full participation in the abolitionist movement. This, in the 1830s going to the 1840s, this is exactly why there is the development of a stance for women's rights, to allow them to have the same public rights, not necessarily political rights, not necessarily economic rights, but public rights when it comes down to their involvement with democratic ideals. So when you go to 1848, you have the first ever women's rights convention. It takes place at Seneca Falls, New York. And so I know I've been saying this on some of the recording, but New York is really showing up over and over again through this time period. One of the central figures at the Seneca Falls Convention is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Miss Stanton, who is going to be a leader of the women's rights movement really for another 30 or 35 or 40 years, for the rest of her life, she is going to take this away from just being a public rights, a public speaking kind of mentality, and the demand for rights is going to go into more towards voting rights and more towards a political sense of equality. I've got Frederick Douglass's name tucked in here as a former enslaved worker in the South that becomes one of the loudest voices towards abolition. He participated at the Seneca Falls Convention because he felt like that women achieving these political rights was a necessary step in order to achieve greater political rights for everybody in the country, to try to get equality not just among the different races, but among genders, and celebrate equality in America. The central document that comes out of the Seneca Falls Convention is called the Declaration of Sentiments. And this is a document that is designed very intentionally to mirror the language in the Declaration of Independence, that enunciation of rights where it was, well, those rights need to be extended. So it opens like the Declaration opens: when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man to assume among the people of the earth a position different from that which they have hitherto occupied, establishing context for the demand for women's rights. And then it goes on to say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And this is using the Declaration of Independence as a model. It lays out the list of grievances that they see as being a problem in 19th century American society, a need to have a reform to, well, fix what they see as one of the most central wrongs in American life. Like we talked about with the temperance movement, like with so many other political movements, there will be an interruption of progress on this during the Civil War and during Reconstruction, because that is very all-consuming, both in a history class and in the reality that people were living through. But this one is strong enough that it is not only going to come up after Civil War and Reconstruction. Issues with women's rights will pop up a couple of times during the Civil War and during Reconstruction. So this is definitely another introduction of a topic that that's going to stick with us for the entire rest of the course.